friends, welcome back or welcome if you're new here. My name is Stacy and I am the chapter conundrum, and in today's video we're going to talk all about my 2025 reading stats. So I am a bit of a stats nerd. I have a reading spreadsheet that I track all of my stuff on every year, and I definitely like at the end of the year and in mid-year and whenever I feel like it, really going to look at the stats that it generates and just noticing trends in my reading and kind of just seeing what has changed, what has stayed consistent. And so I thought I would go ahead and put this video together for you guys. And just before we get into the stats, like if I don't seem like I'm at my normal energy level, it's because I'm not. Jake has given me his flu. And while I don't have like a strong sense of the congestion and cough that he has, I definitely have like the headache, the upset stomach, the fever, all that good jazz. So just bear with me if I'm not my normal energetic self or my brain has a few like what kind of moments. And the first stat that we're going to start off with is how many books did I read? The good old basic. So in 2025, my goal was to read 100, which should have been easy. But 2025 was kind of an insane year in terms of how busy I got and just different things that came up. So I ended up only reading 95. I'm not really mad about this. I wasn't really paying close attention to the actual number that I had read. If I really wanted to, I definitely could have just like prioritized reading some graphic novels and novellas in December and definitely hit that 100. But it's fine. 95 books is still a lot of books. It's just kind of hard to not compare myself to previous years because in 2024, I read 118 books, which I thought was less than my normal. And in 2023, I read 140. So just to give you an idea, like that is going to be important in some like trends in the stats and some of the discussion because I've just read less overall. And so things have shifted due to that. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But anyway, I landed at 95 books. How many pages did I read? Because as a fantasy reader, books don't necessarily tell you a ton. If you're reading really chunky tomes, that's not really going to reflect in your book count. I definitely read less pages as well, though. In 2025, I read 36,731 pages, which is still great. And that's still a lot. That's like 3,000 pages a month, if you think about it. But in 2024, I read 42,109 pages. And in 2023, I read 48,130 pages. And definitely before that, it was over 50,000. Because at one point in time, I had a goal of 1,000 pages a week. But you know what? I'm not mad about it. I accomplished a lot last year. And also, now that I have a channel, filming and planning and editing and scheduling and descriptions and thumbnails, that all takes time. And that tends to take out some reading time. So that's part of the drop for sure. Next up, I like to look at how many rereads did I do. So in 2024, I had 16 rereads. And I predicted that the reread count would stay fairly high in 2025 because one of my big goals last year was to continue on and finish out some series. And I was at the point with a lot of my ongoing series where I knew I was going to have to reread in order to do that. So in 2025, I did 9 rereads. So I feel like I was on track to kind of have the same amount of rereads if I had just read more in general and had more time for mood reading and to work on that goal. But yeah, that is high for me. I'm typically not much of a rereader. The only real exceptions are like all-time favorites or, like I said, series that I need to continue, but I forget what's happening. It's been so long that I feel like I need to reread. Next up, let's go over my series stuff. So in both 2024 and 2025, I've stayed very consistent with how many books in series I've picked up versus how many books that are standalone that I've picked up. In both years, it's basically 50-50, which is kind of fun. I kind of wondered before I looked at the 2025 stats if I would have less books in series just because I tend to pick up more like standalone or easier reads during readathon months, which were definitely my heaviest reading months throughout the year. But also thinking about it, I did do some like series read-alongs where I was continuously picking up like sequels or books in series for the read-along. So it's not that shocking, and it's kind of fun that it's managed to stay completely consistent. Next up, let's talk about my series counts. So I had an ambitious goal of being under 25 ongoing series at the end of 2025. And I was at 27 at the end of 2024. So 25 may not sound that ambitious, but the other big goal I had was to read a bunch of my physical TBR, and a lot of that was starting new series. And so that's why I was thinking like, this is ambitious. You know, it wasn't just a simple matter of, oh, let's finish out 2 more series. And I'm a little sad to say that that didn't pan out. I ended 2025 with 32 ongoing series, though I'm at 31 at the minute, so I've already made some progress. In 2026, I don't think series is going to be one of my goals, just because I really do want to hone in on my physical TBR. I feel like I've been so self-disciplined in so long and not picking up starts of series, but like I have these books for a reason and I want to read them in a timely manner before I become less excited about them. So yeah, I don't think this is necessarily going to be something I worry about this year, but it's something I will continue to track, and I will be sad if my series count like completely balloons and gets out of hand again. But for now, like 32 feels really reasonable. Like when I first started worrying about it, I think I was in the middle of like 60 some odd series, so you know what, I'm not mad about that. Next up, let's go into how many series I started, continued, finished, or caught up on, and DNF'd. And in 2025, I started 18 series. I continued on with 17. I finished out or caught up on 14, and I decided not to continue with 4. And if I compare that to 2024's numbers, it's pretty on trend. It's just like slightly less in each camp just because I read less. So in 2024, I started 21 series, continued on with 22, finished out or caught up on 15, and DNF'd 6. I forgot to have my spreadsheet pulled up for this nonsense. Moving into the book and page counts for each month, I am happy to say that if you compare my 2024 chart to my 2025 chart, I finally broke my June reading curse. I don't know why, but in several years past, June has always been my worst reading month. And it's never intentional. It's always like some kind of weird fluke that ends up having it not work out to where I get a lot of reading time. So, I mean, there was one year that I got home from a trip and then immediately was like sick for a week after, ended up unexpectedly fostering a new dog like a couple days after that, and then got sick again. So that particular year was a wash. There was another year where I just hit a massive reading slump in June. There's other years where I just have like so many social obligations in June. So yeah, it's funny how that has been a thing for me, but I'm happy to say that in 2025, that was no longer a thing. June was a great reading month. So looking at this chart for 2025, absolutely no surprise that April and October were my heaviest reading months because those are our readathon months. Typically July would also be high, but because I ended up having my green card interview in May when I otherwise would be preparing for a July round of a readathon, we ended up canceling July and just moving forward with April and October. So in 2026, we are planning 3. There should be one in April, July, and October, I'm happy to say. And obviously needing ample time to prepare for my green card interview was top priority for me last year. And so that is why my May reading was completely tanked, because basically I had like a mid-May interview. So like the very end of April and the first several weeks of May were just so much preparation for that. Typically, my lower reading months will either be months that are like right after a readathon where I'm kind of like, okay, I need a little bit of time away from reading, or there'll be months where I have to prepare a readathon. And typically that's 2 months before a readathon actually happens because we like to announce it the month before. And so all the prep work happens like 2 months out. So for me, that would typically be February, May, and August. And you can definitely see a little bit of that trend here. Like February wasn't great and August wasn't great, but also it just had like a really slow reading year in general. And in 2025, September was my worst reading month, but that also makes sense because I had my family coming to visit at the end of September. And so I spent a lot of time just getting things ready for them. In terms of page counts, I'm not really seeing any big surprises there. I didn't really have any standouts in those stats either. My best page count month was definitely still back in 2020 where it was almost 9,000. Comparing the charts to 2024, I will also say September last year was definitely my worst month as well, but there was also a specific reason behind that one. So I think it was like summer when I ended up getting like my first piece of actual paperwork that said I was legal in the US. It was my employment authorization. And so I could finally do a whole bunch of life setup stuff that just took a lot of time. So it was things like going to get my state driver's license, opening a bank account, acquiring a new vehicle, and getting car insurance and getting that titled and registered and everything, getting health insurance, just all that kind of stuff. And so that's basically why I didn't read in September of 2024 either. Next up, let's talk about my average rating. So in 2024, my average rating was a 3.89, and in 2025, it was a 3.77. So not a huge drastic change there. I can't remember how many 2 stars I had, but I will put that up here for you guys as well to see my star ratings. I did noticeably have less 5-star reads last year than in 2024, and I think that is basically the reason for the lower rating. I did read a lot of great books, but most of the books I read were probably in the 4-star range. Here's hoping that in 2026 I find more 5 stars to love and this number goes up a lot. Something else I like to track is how many of the books I'm reading are for buddy reads or read-alongs. So in 2025, I had a goal to only sign up for like 4 read-alongs in a month and maybe like 1, maybe 2 other buddy reads in that month, depending on how short they were or how caught up it was, kind of thing. And so 45 of the books I read last year ended up being towards buddy reads or read-alongs, which happened to be 47% of my reading. I did pretty well stick to that, like 4 read-alongs with maybe 1 to 2 other buddy reads. And I think the main reason that my percentage was so high is just that I read a lot less books. So a lot of what I was reading was towards those things. In 2024, I read 41 books that were part of buddy reads or read-alongs, so only 4 less. But it was like 36% of my overall reading instead of like 47. In 2023, though, when I was a little bit more willy-nilly about signing up for whatever buddy reads and read-alongs I wanted, I had 60 books that were part of buddy reads or read-alongs, and that was 43% of my reading. So I think like the overall number isn't that much higher. It's just the percentage, and it's mainly just because I read less. So that's not a huge surprise. Like, I'm still happy with that, and I'm happy that like the overall number stayed kind of lower than it has in previous years. I predict in 2026 it'll stay fairly stable. I do want to make more space for mood reading for sure, and that's partly why I'm limiting myself. But the other piece of that is like I actually have to keep up with the ones that I'm doing in order to have that mood reading space and time. So we'll see how that goes. Hopefully I don't have any more crazy months where I end up like hardly reading. Next up for the age demographics. In 2025, I think 83% of the books I read were adult, 3% were new adult, 11% were YA, and like 2% were middle grades. This is fairly normal for me. In 2024, I had a bit of a departure from that where I read like more YA and less adult. And I think that was just due to clearing off some series and just clearing some physical books off my shelves. I did kind of prioritize a little bit more YA in 2024. So 2025 feels like a return to my normal percentage breakdown of that. So like to compare, I'm going to show you 2023 as well. So in that one, I had like 84% adult, 4% new adult, 8% YA, and about 3% middle grade. So yeah. 2025 looks very similar to 2023 in that vein, but different than 2024 because I had finished out a lot of the YA series I was reading. Next up for format, I had consistently been doing about 60% of my reads on audio, but in 2025, that jumped to 80%. And then I also had like 10% of books mixed media, but multiple formats for whatever reason. Like either I owned the physical book but also got the audio book out from the library, or I switched to doing part of it on ebook, like if I knew I wasn't going to be at home, that type of thing. And then I did 6.2% physical reads and 3% ebooks. So I think the biggest reason for that huge spike in audio is just US library access, because at the beginning of 2025, I, with Jake, went around to a bunch of local libraries within like an hour drive, and we got a whole bunch of library cards that were free for state residents, and of course got onto their Libby. And if I have the choice between audio or ebook, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to pick audio. And because I just had so many library cards that had such great access, I just ended up being able to get audiobooks for free for a whole ton of things. So I don't actually know in 2026 if this will change much. I do have a goal of reading my physical shelves, and I do want to read at least 20 physical books next year. So I think the physical reads will increase. But in terms of like audio decreasing, I think it really depends on whether whatever I'm reading from my physical TBR is available on audio from my library, and whether I want to be doing audio alongside the physical, like either in a mixed media where I'm switching back and forth, or an immersion read type of situation. So we'll see how that all shakes out next year. I'm not sure. In terms of where I sourced these books, like I said, in 2025, my library access broadened considerably, and so I did a lot more books from my library. So I had like 38% of the books I read were library books, and then 23% were from my owned TBR, 15% were from Audible, 10% were books that were gifted to me, 7% was books from Everend, and 2% were books from book boxes. In 2024, I was more like 28% of the books I read were from the library, and about 16% were from Everend. So basically, I've switched from using my Everend subscription for audiobooks to the library, which is a good thing, I think. Honestly, I'm probably going to be canceling my Everend. I just don't think I'm using it enough at this point to justify keeping it, but I'll see how much I end up using it this month. There are, I think, still like 1 or 2 books on there that I have like planned buddy reads or read-alongs for, that's kind of where I was planning to access them. So I'll probably just keep it until that's gone and then let go of it. The next stat we're going to talk about is the genres I read. And this, when I looked at it for 2025, was a big shocker for me at first, because every year, without fail, my most read genre is fantasy. In 2025, fantasy was not first, it was not second, it was third, and I was mind blown by that. But then I also got thinking, like, okay, the months where I read, like the vast majority of the books I read were readathon months, and I typically tend to gravitate towards either thrillers or contemporary romance in those months, just because they're quicker, easier reads that I can get through. And so when I want to read like 20 books in a month, those are kind of more what I would reach for. So that, coupled with the fact that I had 2 thrillers every single month in a buddy reader read along, between the Thrill Chiller Kill book club and the John Mars read along, thriller was my most read genre in 2025, followed by romance, and then fantasy, and then romantasy, sci-fi, horror, and nonfiction were kind of like a smaller percentage. But yeah, looking at my 2024 wheel, that was a lot more typical of me, where my most read genre was by far fantasy, with some thrillers and romance, and then horror, romantasy, sci-fi kind of thrown in. In terms of how many authors I read that were new to me versus authors I had read before, this stayed pretty consistent over the last couple of years. I'm typically between like 30 and 35% new and like 65 to 70% read before. And in 2025, I was 30-70. In 2024, I was 33-67. In terms of the gender of the authors I read, this also stayed fairly consistent for me over the last couple years. I tend to read a few more female authors. So in 2025, I read like 56% female authors, 41% male authors, and 2% other, which would either be a scenario of like the author is non-binary, or the book was written by multiple authors from different genders. And then in 2024, I did 60% female authors, 37% male authors, and 3% other authors. Then the last stat I always like to look at is what publishers am I picking up books from the most? And to be honest, like, I don't really worry about who publishes what I'm reading, but the main reason I track this is so that if I ever decide to get really serious about requesting ARCs in the future, I'll know which publishers to maybe focus on building a good relationship with, because they're historically who I pick up books from. So yeah, I do like to at least fill that in my spreadsheet and get a chart at the end of the year. And I'm happy to say that in 2025, my highest was definitely self-published. It didn't really feel like I read that many self-pub books, but I guess I was just like jumping around to different publishers with everything else that I read. So that I ended up coming up on top, which I'm not mad about at all. But what did change is kind of like the traditional publishers that were higher up on my list last year. And that was mainly Berkley, Thomas & Mercer, Red Tower, and Daw. So obviously with fantasy not being my most read genre, that's like the biggest reason for this change. But I think Thomas & Mercer does a lot of the John Mars books I read. And then Daw, obviously I was doing the Green Rider read along, so it would make sense that I was picking up a lot of their books when I did reach for fantasy. In 2024, my most read publishers were definitely Orbit, Tor, and Del Rey. So that was it for looking at a bunch of the reading stats I had from 2025 and comparing them to previous years and kind of talking about trends. So let me know down below in the comments, if you do track your own reading stats, what stat from your own kind of like stats overview or stats wrap up surprised you the most? I definitely know not everyone is as interested in their reading stats as I am, but I figure if you made it this far into the video, you probably are, and you probably have your own reading stats. So definitely let me know that down below. I'm really curious to hear about that. This year, mine was definitely my most read genre. That blew my mind because, like I said, it's always fantasy. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out if you want to, and have a great day. Bye!